let's start with the secondary. There's a lot of really new faces upcoming when it comes to the Houston Cougars secondary. But of course, there's some key returners as well. When you look at players that had key minutes for the team last season, a unit that really struggled overall over the course of the season, but key returners in Alex Hogan, Jalen Emery, Noah Guzman, Antonio Brooks, and a couple of players that didn't necessarily get a lot of playing time as well, but in Mike Welch, Dante Wynn, and Garyon Robinson. Of course, when it comes to the secondary, there are 10 new faces upcoming when it comes to this 2023 Houston Cougars roster. And the most notable, there's a couple that are notable, but I think the biggest transfer get for the Houston Cougars football team was Adari Halsey, a transfer from New Mexico. And he has a lot of accolades, and for good reason, coming into the 2023 season. Pro Football Focus's preseason All Big 12 Conference third team for Houston, and even Dave Campbell's Texas football top 10 transfer portal pickups for Houston. And like I said, for good reason, he had 86 total tackles for New Mexico in 2022, forced 2 fumbles. He had 2 picks. Of course, that was for a struggling New Mexico team, but he was able to rack up the stat sheet when it comes to what he was able to do last season. And even Malik Fleming as well, another name to keep an eye on when it comes to the transfer portal that Houston was able to add. He had 41 tackles for East Carolina last season. He had 3 picks and deflected 6 passes. And like I said, this is a unit that struggled mightily when it comes to the Houston Cougars football team in 2022. Dan, I'm going to toss it over to you, but first, these stats. When it came to passing defense, Houston ranked 122nd in the entire country. That's right, 122nd. They gave up 278 and a half yards, passing yards only. We're not even getting into the rushing game. 278.5 passing yards per game to their opponent. So obviously that's going to be a unit that, I mean, when you look at it, there's really only one way to go when it comes to direction, and hopefully that's up for the Houston Cougars football team.
You're right about that. And just looking at the landscape of college football and even pro football at that, it's a passing game now, especially going into the Big 12. You're going to face high-powered offense after high-powered offense. Let's just start with UTSA and their quarterback, Frank Harris, and the receivers that he has. So I think it's going to be very, very important for Houston's cornerback play to be much better and much improved than last year. You mentioned a few players who have some experience coming back. And I think it starts with, like you said, Alex Hogan and Jalen Emery, but then a couple of other players that I'm keeping an eye on from transfers, like you mentioned, the one from New Mexico who you just mentioned, who uh, has a lot of upside and has a lot of predictions as well. But also a name that I'm keeping an eye on is Isaiah Hamilton, the transfer from Texas Southern, right across the street. I'm hearing players rave about him, and I'm hearing his transition has been seamless to a higher level and into Houston. And a lot of these kids they're referring to, they're actually from Houston. They went to other places, other schools first, but they come back home. And so I think that's extra added motivation to put on for the name across their chest, which happens to be their hometown. But I think um, this defense, I don't want to say it starts with the cornerback play, but it's very important that they have very consistent, good quality cornerback play. And a lot of times they would come in opportune times, third and longs, fourth and longs, different scenarios where they'll give up big plays. And then that's not even thinking about the SMU game.
Most definitely. Put a pin on it real quick. For those of you that are joining us live, like to be part of the conversation on YouTube, or even if you're watching on X, be sure to comment. We want to hear from you. What are your expectations on the secondary and just overall the Houston Cougars defense as a whole? If you're just joining us, we love to hear from you guys. Or if you're watching us on audio only platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the next day, be sure to reach us out on social media. Once again, it's going to take a while to get used to, but on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Pawd Slama Jama. Down, you hit it right on the head when it came to struggles, and I think specifically with this secondary, it was just a lot. Injuries played a part of it, but it often seemed like the biggest struggle for the secondary was being able to stop the bleeding. There'd be a couple times where teams would literally just they would check down. They would throw 5 yard routes, not necessarily big chunk plays. For the most part, teams weren't throwing it all over the place. It was the inability to be able to come up and make the tackles and stop a short play from becoming a medium sized or oftentimes big plays. That was really what hurt the Houston Cougars defense, and specifically, you mentioned it, being unable to make stops. Houston was tied for 111th in the country when it came to third down conversion defense. Opposing teams converted on Houston on third downs 43% of the time. That number, believe it or not, actually got worse when it came to fourth down conversion defense, in which their opponents were converting over 50% of the time. It was actually 55.9% of the time. So this was a unit overall, not just on the secondary for those last two stats, but specifically just the defense that really, really struggled for Houston in the 2022 season. It was a big reason why Houston had a bit of a lackluster season when it came to the expectations they had coming into from the preseason.
You hit on very two good points to start, and which is fundamentals tackling. A lot of those big plays that they gave up came off broken tackles. And so if they can kind of take a step back over this offseason, entering the fall camp, and realize how the importance of wrapping up tackling football, which I'm sure Coach Buck always raves about running to the football and being active and pursuing the football, but also situational football. I mean, we can't talk enough. We don't have enough time to talk about how Houston struggle in situational football, whether it's third and long or fourth down situations. And Houston has to do a better job of not only rushing the quarterback, which we'll get to the D line in a second, but actually covering and making plays. I think they have to get turnovers. That's one thing that I think will help the offense even more is the ability to take the ball away. Houston hasn't really had a lot of turnovers last year. I know the year before that, yeah, the year before
The
that when they had
2021 season.
yeah, when they had the 21, they had a very successful season. And you look at the two bookend corners that they had with Marcus Jones and Pepe Williams, those two NFL caliber corners who played well, very fundamental, made plays, but they were able to take the ball away. I think Houston must get back to that, taking the ball away and creating um, short fields for their offense.
No, most definitely. One of the things that head coach Dana Holgerson has alluded to, he reiterated multiple times over the course of the season, the ball didn't bounce our way. Oftentimes, there would be a couple of times when Houston would, whether it be forcing fumbles and they just weren't able to secure the football in big moments. And even when it came to early on in the season, it seemed like they still had a little bit of that magic and being able to force turnovers. Look at even the Texas Tech game against the Texas Tech game against Donovan Smith and the interceptions they were able to force on Smith, and even going back to the UTSA game, it's just opportunistic. And then when Derek Parrish went down, the explosivity of the defense and being able to get turnovers just completely fell off a cliff. And Dan, you're absolutely right. When you look at Houston's defense overall as a whole in the 2022 season, they were tied 105th, and when it came to turnovers, and it was just 14 turnovers that they were able to get overall for the season. So that's certainly going to be an area that they're going to be looking to improve on. Once again, Kevin Josso and Tony M all joining us on YouTube. We'd like to hear from you. What are your thoughts specifically on the secondary and overall on the Houston Cougars defense? Robbins, we will get to your question later on when we talk about the linebackers and the defensive line, but just hold on. We'll get to them in a moment. But no, that's a great point, especially when you look specifically for the secondary. We alluded to this over the course of the season a year ago, but a lot of these players that were kind of put in positions to learn through the fire. Like I said, injuries played a big role, and they had to get tossed in there in situations where whether they were ready or not, it was go out there and sink or swim. And you could tell at times that there were some growing pains. Kevin Johnson says depth, and more depth. That's definitely going to be key for Houston in their inaugural year in the Big 12.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right about this. Sometimes the best experience is playing experience for players. And I think the players like a Jalen Emery, who, as the season went on, starts to become more and more of his own. And I think some of the transfers that we mentioned, they have a ton of playing experience, but now it's about putting it all and gelling together as a Cougar unit. I think the players have talent, but like the comment you said, we need depth, 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 because you never know when injuries occur. And at the same time, you're going to face a lot of fast, up tempo, high powered offenses who will look to get as many plays in as possible. In which, to the point, you need depth. All players aren't going to be able to play every single snap of the game, and so having quality depth to not have a drop off is something Houston always talks about, especially over the last couple of years of building that depth and having that depth come in and be able to play to the level of the player that they were placing on the field. And so I think depth is key, but more importantly, like you said, getting back to the fundamentals, making sure you're tackling, make sure you're mentally prepared for situational football to not allow a lot of plays who could be in your favor based on the down in the situation, but the other team will make a play. So I think Houston has the players, has the young players who I think have grown in the system and grown together, and I think they're ready to make a name in the Big 12.
Jalen Emery was the name that you just mentioned. I think just overall, again, going back to that inexperienced aspect when it came to the positions they were put in, but they specifically when it came to Emery, and even I think you can throw an Alex Hogan in there as well, where they would, like I said, they had to play a lot. There would be a couple of flashes in during the season when you would be able to tell, like, hey, there's something there. They made a great play, and then a play or two later, they come back and they make a not so good play. And again, that's that inconsistency standpoint that you expect from inexperienced players. And hopefully going into the 2023 season, they've been able to grow over the year of the 2022 season, have that experience under their belt, and most importantly, just continue to have that improvement aspect. And they're still going to continue to be tried by fire because now, like you alluded to, Dan, it's going to be a Big 12 schedule, and it's not going to be easy even in week one, even though they're not facing a Big 12 opponent and a veteran quarterback for UTSA. I do want to mention Noah Guzman, who I kind of glossed over at the beginning of this segment, but he seems to be a player that the Cougars are really high on. The Houston coaching staff is really high on. He's obviously has a single-digit number heading into the season, which from head coach Dana Horson's standpoint, something that they don't take lightly. If you have one of those single-digit numbers, they expect high things from you, and it's not just from on the field, but specifically when it comes to leadership standpoint. He was a player that didn't necessarily stand out when it comes to just looking at the stat sheet, but again, he seems to be someone that the staff is very high on, so he could be a name to keep an eye on. And like I said as well, with a couple of transfers and 10 new faces overall in this unit, Kevin Hassel says will depend also if McCutcheon can play immediately or not, and that's a great point. He's talking about, obviously, of course, Latrell McCutcheon, who transferred over from USC, had transferred from Oklahoma the year prior to that. He went from Oklahoma to USC and then to USC to Houston, so we will see if he's eligible to play immediately or not. That's a great point. But Deon, any final points about the secondary specifically before we move on?
Yeah, one quick point on Guzman. That he's a player that has familiarity not only with Houston being here last season, but also with the coaching staff. He is a player who transferred from West Virginia, very, very, very familiar with the system. And like you said, that single digit means something. That means he's earned it. That means he's proved it in practice. And I'm expecting him to have an impact as well. I know we only mentioned him briefly, but that was a good catch by you. And want to make sure um, Cougar fans keep their eye out for Guzman. He had some snaps last year, and I expect he'll have a bigger impact this season as well.